Okay, here's the screencast. I promised it, you guys. And so, what we're talking about this week is editing. Um, what we want to try to focus now on is not necessarily how to edit, okay? You've had plenty of classes on how to edit a film. What we need to do now is watch our film and focus just on the editing decisions made in the movie. How is the editing contributing to your experience of the film? Um, so I've got this handy little PowerPoint here that we're going to step through and sort of keep me on track and see how exactly we focus on the editing. Um, as we know, the film is actually, that you're watching has been told 3 times. You're watching the third time it's been told. When it was written, it was a story told by the screenwriter. That screenplay was then translated into a shooting process, and the director then takes over and decides where the camera goes, gets the actors to perform what is in the script, and everybody else involved in the picture is there supporting the vision of the film, so some decisions are made in how the story is told there. And then the editor takes all of those materials and tries to put together an actual telling, what you actually see on the screen. And some pretty profound decisions actually get made in the editing process. So what we need to do is to kind of step through the various process in which an editor makes these decisions and isolate them and evaluate what those decisions were, and then come up with some ideas about how those decisions influenced your experience. The first thing that an editor does is a process of selectivity. So what we're talking about here is picking the shots. And, in any given moment in a film, that moment might be covered in several different angles. A close-up, a wide shot, an over-the-shoulder, whatever. And the editor decides which angle and how to cover that particular moment. And also what is selected is a particular take of that angle. So just because a director decided to shoot 10 takes of a particular moment, a line, let's just say, a performance, and on the 10th take the director's like, that's it, that's the one I want. That doesn't necessarily mean that when it gets into the editing room that's the actual take that's used. The editor is looking at the performance and is the only one that's actually seeing how these pieces fit together. The director certainly might have an idea, but the editor is actually seeing it cut together from one shot to the next and pieces together a performance that tells the story in the editor's eyes as best as possible. The sensibilities are all the same. We need to make sure that the audience understands what's happening and appreciates what's going on and, can appreciably read the behavior, the actions, the objectives of the characters. So selectivity is the first step in the process. Which angle do I use? Which take do I use? And starts stepping through, let's just say, a scene and piecing together something that makes clear sense and has a, I would say, movement to it. But we'll get to that. The next thing an editor does is focuses then on coherence, continuity, and rhythm. Rhythm is something that kind of is last in that list, and rightfully so. The first thing is coherence. Can the audience understand what the hell's going on? The first thing is in a conversation, cutting from one shot to the next, does the conversation make sense? Can the audience follow what's going on? Hopefully it's written with some coherence, and hopefully it's directed with some coherence and enough coverage to cut it together. But ultimately the editor decides, does it make sense? Can we piece it together? And sometimes that involves, cutting lines out, cutting chunks of the dialogue out. That happens a lot more than you think, or maybe you think it does. I don't know. But That is certainly the case. The next is continuity. And continuity just means being able to follow the action. Now, that's physical action, something as simple as cutting from someone's across the room, like moving across the room, exiting the frame, entering the shot in another cut, so that we can follow the physical movement in the scene. But continuity also involves continuity of the conversation, continuity of the ideas, continuity of the objective of the character. Can we follow what they're doing? And finally, rhythm. And rhythm is more of a stylistic choice, but we're getting down to, does the rhythm of the editing do justice of the rhythm of the conversation? If you'll sit and listen to somebody having a conversation, you'll notice that there's a natural rhythm to it, and that rhythm speaks to how we communicate. It speaks to body language, the tone of the conversation. It helps us understand subtext. When people speak slowly in a conversation, it tends to give the moment a much weightiness to it. It usually implies that people are having a difficult time deciding what to say and when to say it. Or if the conversation is light and quick, it has a different tone altogether. And are those choices the editor's making serving the story? And is it ultimately affecting, your understanding of the moment, the emotional quality, and the subtextual quality, and your understanding and your experience? Transitions, like this book is probably one of the, I guess, the best and I guess well-written book about appreciating films. And he takes particular interest in certain aspects of the editing. And, transitions are important. They do communicate important information. And, for instance, what is the difference between a hard cut, when we just cut from one shot to the next, and, let's say, a dissolve? A dissolve communicates different information. The way we interpret that is different than, let's say, a straight cut or a wipe or a fade to black and then fade back up again. Usually a dissolve might communicate the passage of time. A fade to black and a fade back up might include not only a greater passage of time, but also a transition or a new moment or a new, I would say, chapter in the storytelling, if that makes sense. It indicates that the story is headed in a new direction, or the previous shot, came to a somewhat of a conclusion in terms of maybe what a character's objective was, and we sort of move on from that onto an entirely new direction of the story. It's for you to determine. It's for you to figure out and find in the storytelling, and pinpoint how that transition is communicating information directly related to the story, but also is helping the audience understand that information and where the story is going. He lists wipes and flip frames, and the star wipe is one of my favorites. It's really a quite a profound transition, and the dissolve or the crossfade is something we see a lot as well. So look at the transitions. And this is typically between scenes, but sometimes you'll see editors putting, somewhat non-standard, transitions in the middle of a scene, and you've got to figure out, well, why did the editor do that? Or what is that, how's that contributing to my understanding of the story? Did I just, here, I'm trying to, okay. Rhythms, tempo, and time control. Editing controls the passage of time. In a scene where the entire thing takes place in one take and there's no editing, screen time or movie time is the same as the passage of time as you're watching it. But when we start including editing, I think in a natural conversation, it implies that it is the equal amount of time, but we can subtly manipulate that, or not so subtly manipulate the passage of time. We can expand moments. We can make moments that would take a fraction of a second seem to take many seconds on the screen. And you have to ask, why would an editor make that choice? As with anything in terms of cinematography, placement and composition, the use of color, the use of contrast, all of these techniques are used to direct the audience's attention. When we elaborate on a moment and expand the time it takes to actually complete a said moment, let's say just somebody walking down the hall, it would normally take 3 seconds to make that cross in real life, but in in a scene, the editor might choose to make that moment take a hell of a lot longer to accentuate and draw our attention to probably something subjective about the character, what they're feeling, what they're thinking, the anxiety of the moment, or ultimately just put our attention on it so that we try to figure it out, we try to understand it. We can also compress time. We can make time, well, here we are, I'm already talking about expansion and compression of time, but we can make those moments go a lot faster, and that might be simply so the audience understands continuity in terms of movement, continuity in terms of action, but don't particularly want to spend real time to convey that information. We want to move the story along. Tempo and rhythm have to do with kind of what we were talking about before, the pace of the editing, and that can directly affect, just like in music, it can be slow, the tempo can be slow, and that conveys a certain mood and tone to the content, in this case music, or it could be fast-paced, heavy-handed, and that conveys an entirely different tone. And what you want to do is, analyze the film and particular moments, especially those moments that really stick out to you and have, were moments in the film that you really remember and thought were quite effective and, come to mind when you think about your experience of the film. And you want to look at those scenes and look at the editing and see how much that contributed to your understanding and your experience. Slow motion is often something that is not necessarily always the editor's choice. Something typically has to be shot in slow or fast motion and with something specific in mind in terms of how it is conveying a moment and telling the story, but an editor can have some control over that. But the use of slow motion can convey information. Typically what happens when you, especially in the extreme slow motion, it renders what that shot is showing in a way that leads it towards an abstraction. It's not how we normally see things. We don't see in slow motion unless you're under the influence of some sort of substance. But even then, it's drawing our attention to something. We're appreciating something in a way that we normally don't appreciate them. And that's not me advocating the use of substances. But slow motion can intensify the quality of a moment. We can see something in a way and appreciate the movement of something that we couldn't see unless it was slowed down. It could exaggerate effort, fatigue. It could exaggerate frustration. It can convey superhuman speed or power. I mean, it can convey a lot of things. The way to do it is to look at slow motion, the use of slow motion in your film, if you see it occur, and to figure out exactly what it is conveying and how it is conveying it. Certainly it's the passage of time, and and it certainly provides a contrast to normal motion. In the context of a scene, things might be moving along just fine, and we're following things, and all of a sudden something slips into slow motion. Well, that slow motion really stands out because everything else was in normal motion. And, slow motion suddenly draws your attention to something. It's asking you to pay particular attention to it. And when we cut back to, let's say, normal speed, that in itself is also drawing attention to the moment in which we cut back. There's lots of little strategies that an editor can use to, accentuate and sort of command our attention and direct our attention to things that are important. The freeze frame, thawed frame, and stills. Movies like Election, that's the one that comes to mind when I think of the freeze frame, is often, trying to achieve the same thing. It's just another trick, another tool in the editor's toolbox to figure out how to direct the audience's attention and get them focused on something. Creative juxtaposition montage is something we see in a lot of films. It's often a very cliche technique, and it gets made fun of quite a bit. Team America was really classic in its use, and making fun of making a music number of the montage. But the montage is a very useful tool in terms of really compressing time, showing action, showing a sequence that needs to convey a certain amount of information. It could be somebody doing something. It could be I don't know. It could be a lot of different things. You got to understand that what a montage is a juxtaposition of several different shots and sequences, usually with a continuity of action or objective. A juxtaposition, just so that's clear, is a technique in which we take two disparate things, two images, let's just say, and each image by themselves have one meaning. But when we put them together, that their placement together creates an entirely new meaning, different than each as an individual. And for instance, if I showed you the image of, let's say, a pot of boiling water, okay, what comes to mind? What does that mean? Well, it could mean heat, it could mean steam, it could mean food, it could mean work, sterilization, I don't know, okay? It has its own meaning. Now erase that from your mind, okay? Pot of boiling water goes away. I don't want to influence the next shot because I don't want to juxtapose them just yet. So if I showed you a next shot and it was a kitten, okay? It's a kitten and it's playing, and by itself, what does that convey? Oh, it's cute. It's maybe it makes you think of sneezing and runny eyes. Maybe it, innocence, burden. I don't know. It could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But when I put pot of boiling water and kitten, it implies danger. That something might be, this kitten might be boiled in water. Okay, but that's not what actually happens. But that's what you assume, right? Because we juxtapose those images together. That's the fundamental concept behind juxtaposition. It's really kind of run-of-the-mill Gestalt theory, but we won't go into that. Okay. Next is let's just look at some of these questions about editing that you can ask yourself as you're watching the film or watching, let's just say, a scene. Your assignment will be to find a scene in your film that you found particularly powerful, and just focusing on that scene. You're going to use, your assignment this week will be just, focusing on one scene in particular. But here's some questions you can ask. How does the editing effectively guide our thoughts, associations, and emotional responses from one image to another so that smooth continuity and coherence are achieved? In case you can't read, I just read that question for yourself. Or I read it for you. You can read it for yourself. But in the broadest sense, looking at the editing, how did it convey information? How does it help us understand the associations between actions and characters, one shot to the next, and the emotional responses that you have, and the emotional content of the scene, and how the editing might or might not make those emotions and objectives accessible to you. Is the editing smooth, natural, unobtrusive? I hope so. Or is it sticky and self-conscious? Bad editing draws attention to itself, and typically that's not what we want, unless the editing and the sort of awkwardness of the editing serves the moment that it's trying to render. And in that case, it's not necessarily drawing attention to itself because it makes sense and it helps us understand the moment. How much does the editor communicate through creative juxtapositions, ironic transitions, montages, and the like, and how effective is this communication? So look at when a juxtaposition occurs. Now, two people talking to each other and over the shoulders is not necessarily is not necessarily juxtaposition, although it is a juxtaposition because it is implying that these two people are talking to each other. And if I just had one person talking and then another person talking, we wouldn't necessarily make the connection that by themselves that these two people are, we wouldn't know who's talking to each other. But in a juxtaposition, in the context in which they're speaking, it can convey, let's say, a person staring like this, and then the next shot would, let's say, be a watch. I don't really have a watch, but it would be a clock on the wall, let's just say. And that person, when the moment was filmed, was probably not looking at a clock. And but because we put those two pieces together, it conveys somebody waiting, impatient, anxious. It can convey a lot of different information just by putting two images together, when by themselves they don't mean that. This is a concept called inflection. A shot like just a shot of a clock is uninflected. It means it isn't imbued with any information all by itself. Inflection is simply when meaning is conveyed beyond just what the words are. For instance, if I said shit, okay, that might have some inflection to it. If I said shit, the inflection communicates information. The word is the same, okay, but the inflection means that there is some information imbued upon the word. So, juxtaposition, the clock by itself is uninflected. It doesn't have any information. But when I put the two images together, somebody doing this, and then the shot of the clock, now it's inflected. It adds some meaning. What is the effect of editorial cutting and the transitions and the pace of the film as a whole? So, looking at the transitions, looking at the cutting, and really studying how it affects the pace and timing and time control in the film, and how does that help us understand the moment or what's happening in the film. Sometimes pacing, you might have a lot of fast pace, but then the next scene or the next moment we might hold on a shot for quite a long time, or the following scene might be slow pace, slower editing, and that sort of creates, I guess what we call, maybe tempo, in the sense that, we want to vary. Well, I'm talking about you doing the editing, but in the film itself, a lot of times the editing is crafted in a way that gives us a chance to take a breath. Let's say in an action film, an action sequence is often cut very quickly to create excitement. When shots don't land on the screen for very long, our eyes have to spend a lot of time searching and following the action. We're not sure. It creates some tension because you're not sure if you're following the action correctly. That can create tension, but, tension can only go so far, all right? In a film, tension can't escalate to the point where we, fall on the ground and have a seizure or, anything like that. Tension can only go so far. So what we have to do is release that tension. Editing can help release the tension and, give the audience a chance to catch their breath before slowly building the pace and the tempo and the intensity of what is actually happening in the story or the plot to escalate that tension again. And over the course of the whole film, we might begin with building the tension, and we'll build it up to here and release it, and build it back up to here and release it, and build it back up to here. And by the time you get to the end of the film, you've only built it up this far again, but it feels more intense. How does the cutting speed, which determines the average speed of each shot, and that's just how long it lasts on the screen, which is something you'll be actually trying to keep track of in your assignment, how does that correspond to the emotional role of the scene involved, the emotional role, or the role of emotion? Can you correlate the two? How long a shot lasts and the speed of the cutting, and it's how it conveys information in terms of emotional intensity, both of the emotional intensity in the scene and the emotional intensity of your experience. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're not the same. What segments of the film are overly long or boring? Um, I guess it's important to find moments where the storytelling kind of falls apart. Your experience is somewhat ambiguous. You're not really sure what is happening, or it's confusing. We can learn a lot about the mistakes in a film and the problems with the film, and look at the editing and see if that, if the problem resides there, and determine could there been a better way to cut the scene that would have been more effective. Moving on, as soon as my computer decides it wants to move on. Oh, no, that's it. It's over. Um, so straightforward. There's really not a whole lot to really look at. I mean, editing is a very complex discipline and craft, and there's a lot of strategies and techniques that can be used, and beyond the scope of necessarily forming writing criticism and studying the film. But you can pick a scene and really pick it apart and study the editing for things, how long a take is, the different size shots and the sequence in those shots, the suggested emotional content of the edit. The beginning shot might be a wide shot, and what's the subjective emotional content? Maybe nothing. Maybe it's like a big zero. But through the course of the editing in the scene, we might move to two shots, we might move to over the shoulders and close-ups and extreme close-ups, and it's conveying more and more subjective information and having more and more emotional effect on us. And we want to kind of keep track of that. And those are strategies that, once you discover them in a film and you see things that you like and techniques that you like, steal them, okay? Try to emulate them, use them, find moments in, your storytelling that, would best benefit from those techniques and strategies. Before I end our conversation here, I want to point out one sort of broad general editing technique, and that is moving, cutting from the outside in and vice versa from the inside out. And really those two strategies are based on, let's say, standard coverage. Outside in means we start with a wide shot and we orient the viewer to the space, the people in the space, where are we, who's there, and what is the spatial relationship between them. And so, we give the audience a broad picture first, and then as the scene progresses, we cut in tighter and tighter and move in and move the audience's attention to what is happening in terms of what characters are doing, what are they saying, who are they saying it to, and bringing their attention more on the dynamic between the characters. That's moving from the outside in. But not all scenes are cut that way. You can cut moving from the inside out, starting with extreme close-ups. And, the viewer is left to sort of wonder and question, what are the relationships? Where are they? What are they doing? Who are they talking to? And then slowly the editing moves out, revealing where they are, who they're talking to. And, that might be an effective technique, especially if the editing and the storytelling wants to lead you to assume certain things about relationships to reveal that they are in fact something other than you expected. And that might help the storytelling, it might help the moment. It might, cutting from the inside out, might also reflect specifically a subjective of a character in which they don't really understand what they're doing, what's going on. And as editing moves out, it's sort of following the natural progression of what a character is experiencing. And, that might be a technique there. It's a pretty broad technique, but it's one that you can typically see. It's usually, either outside in or inside out, or, it's a variation of the two. We might move from the outside in and then back out, or start in, move out, move back in. That's typically a type of editing continuity that needs to be fairly well structured so that the audience can follow what's going on. And but I don't want to convey that editing is just merely creating coherence and continuity. Editing may also be the storytelling. Like I said before, moving from the inside out, how it's edited might engage the audience in a question which is storytelling. It's engaging them, and through the course of the scene, we reveal something by moving out and answering that question and hopefully generating a new one. Check out the assignment sheet, look at the assignment, and and give it a whirl, and focus just on the editing. One strategy might be, to turn the sound off just to see how so that the editing and the cuts really stand out. Turn the sound back on, see how the editing is wedded to what is said, what is heard, and and see if there's a clear understanding of the relationship between how it's edited and the content of the story. And ultimately, answering questions about how did it contribute to your experience of the film. Okay, that's it. Get to work.